Get out your sleeveless shirts and jean jackets because today we are ranking 80s thrash metal debut albums.
Loud, fast, heavy, you know.
We're gonna kick things off on a big note with Testament and The Legacy in 1987. Arguably one of the most respected thrash metal bands out there, and they kicked it right out of the park from the very start with this debut, I think. Tied for highest fan-rated album on Metal Storm alongside The Gathering. Killer riffs throughout the album with a good mix of speed and melody. I can also hear some hooks that feel like they rubbed off on bands like At the Gates and Soilwork from the Gothenburg Megadeth scene. Also love the more grand and atmospheric intro of Burnt Offerings. Start to finish headbanger. Perfection. Next up, we have Metallica with Kill Em All in 1983. Very thrash and rolly kind of album with sort of a lighter, bouncier sound than what would come after this. That said, I still think that people saying the new material sounds anything like this are straight up delusional.
Ooh, you smell that? It smells like someone's wrong. And it's not me.
Like, I can hear some of the similarities in the guitar work, but the overall aesthetic and the modern polish make them night and day, in my opinion. Regardless, great riffing on this album and soloing, in part thanks to Dave Mustaine, of course. Potential spicy take, though, on this list, I think it's kind of mid.
Right to jail, right away.
Whiplash, Metal Militia, and Seek and Destroy are great, though, and I dig Phantom Lord and No Remorse. Honestly, I know it's a classic, but I'm much more of a Ride the Lightning guy myself. You can actually check out my full Metallica rankings after this one, but for me, this is still great for what it is, but there's just way better albums on this list, in my opinion. Next up, we have Tankard with Zombie Attack in 1986. Some German drinking thrash here. Very fun album full of D-beats and campy imagery. Maybe just a little bit unremarkable. Like, it's a good time for a listen, but I'm not sure it's as memorable or impactful as some of the competition here, and it also gets kind of repetitive. I do like the church bells and synth on the intro to Maniac Forces, which feels like a precursor to similar intros we'd get in the 90s from early black metal bands. I'd never thought I'd talk about second wave black metal and Tankard in the same sentence, but there you go. And this won't be the first time we will be referencing early black metal. I'd say this album's just okay. Honestly, there's no bad albums on this list, which is why I set up the ranking the way it is, but yeah, just one of the lower ones for me. Another big one here, Kreator with Endless Pain in 1985. I'm a big early Kreator fan, and while I don't love this one as much as the follow-up, I just can't get enough of the balls-to-the-wall aggression and some of the more vicious vocals in the genre you can find. Mila Petroza in particular has such a fantastically vile snarl with more than a touch of that early, again, black metal energy. There's really not a track on here that I don't bang my head to, and they all just sound like pure, undistilled rage. Tormentor, Flag of Hate, Bonebreaker. Another one going to perfection.
Based.
Next up is Voivod with War and Pain in 1984. Pretty basic 80s thrash and speed metal album with some kind of Venom vibes and a healthy dose of straight up punk and rock and roll. Again, nothing particularly noteworthy I'd say about this one, especially considering I don't think that they truly hit their stride and found their unique sound until albums like Nothing Face, personally. Another one, you can check out my full tier list for my extended thoughts on their whole discography. I loved the new album Synchro Anarchy, by the way. This one, though, is just going to good. All right, another one of the big four. I've kind of spread them out throughout this list, but we have Megadeth with Killing Is My Business and Business Is Good in 1985. This album goes super hard and definitely does what it was meant to, and kind of being a bit of a middle finger to Metallica after all the ugliness. It has this serious sense of attitude and rebelliousness that is very infectious. Last Rites, Love to Death is a great way to open the album on a high note with serious riffage, and Dave just keeps it going from there. Honestly, it's hard to pick favorites on this one because they're all pretty much fantastic. I'm not as big of a fan of the second half of the album as the first, but it's still really excellent. And honestly, one of the best thrash metal albums, and fighting words here, I do think that it's better than Kill 'Em All.
How dare you!
Not quite perfection, but it's going to fantastic. Next up is Artillery with Fear of Tomorrow in 1985. Danish thrash metal band here, and one where I'm gonna start the term dad metal from here, because there are a few albums I think fit into this category. Like, even being a dad myself, this just feels like too dad, if that makes sense at all. I find it to be a little bit flat, and it doesn't do much to stand out or make me remember any of the riffs once it's over. Some pretty wicked soloing though, and again, nothing on this list truly terrible, and mileage will vary, but for me, this is another one that's kind of low on the food chain. I'm putting it at okay. Back to another heavy hitter here in Annihilator with Alice in Hell, 1989. You are looking blue. Definitely a different opener to a lot of these with the acoustic guitar of Crystal Ann. Quite pretty, really. And then they followed up with Alice in Hell, which is probably one of my favorite thrash metal tracks, period. Cradle of Filth actually did a really good cover of it a few years back. And just in general, very catchy album, with lots of earworm hooks, both from the guitars and the vocals on tracks like WTYD. Some real shredders too, like Schizos Are Never Alone. The only thing that pulls it down a little are some of the cringier lyrics. I'm looking at you, burns like a buzzsaw blade. Really tight album otherwise. I'm putting this one at fantastic. Then we've got Sepultura with Morbid Visions in 1986. Some fun trivia if you didn't know, aside from the rough production, Max has said that they didn't even fully tune their guitars and they knew very little English, so the lyrics were translated word for word. And it definitely makes for a pretty charming debut from a couple of Brazilian dudes who are clearly inspired by the more satanic vibes of Slayer at this point. I can also hear how, along with the likes of Celtic Frost and Bathory and Venom, which we're going to talk about, this is also a starting point for some of the earliest black metal bands. Hell, there's even a track called Mayhem. It's got this really unique cavernous quality to it with this atmosphere that really stands out from most of the other albums on this list. And as someone who digs that, I'd say its shortcomings end up becoming a strength in a way. There's just, again, something so charming about it. So I'm putting it at great tier, and I do actually, I enjoy listening to this more than Kill 'Em All.
No.
Next up is Death Angel with the Ultra Violence in 1987. Now, there was a lot of buzz in the comments about how we did these guys dirty in the thrash band ranking, so I was pretty interested to expand my knowledge of this one. Another highly regarded genre classic, and another killer opener with the wailing riffs of thrashers. It's a 7-minute one too, but they managed to keep it moving the whole time. Love that bass transition to the final third, one of many on this album. And that's not even the longest track, with the titular instrumental going 10.5 minutes. Voracious Souls alone demonstrates a huge variety of sounds and definitely made me eat my words from my previous statements. I can admit when I'm wrong. Lots of vitality in these performances. It feels like I'm almost listening to something live, and especially considering that everyone here is under 20, with drummer Andy Galleon only 14. I gotta give props for that. So yeah, this one also going to perfection. Next up is Razor with Executioner Song in 1985. I like the guitar work of this band, but sometimes Stace's lower register reminds me of the voice from the Happy Happy Joy Joy song.
It's the Happy Happy Joy Joy song.
And I don't know, like, it's well played, but I find the riffs to be on the more generic side. None of the songs really stick out to me, and again, another one I'd say falls into kind of that dad metal energy for me. Like, it's just not doing it for me. I realize that's a very subjective take, but this entire list is only meant to represent my own opinion anyways, and nothing more. So this one for me, going to okay. Next up, we have Anthrax with Fistful of Metal in 1984. To be perfectly honest, Anthrax has always been my least favorite of the big four.
I am shocked. Shocked! Well, not that shocked.
But credit to where it's due, there are some really great performances on this album. Death Rider in particular is an amazing opener with the breakneck speed, falsetto vocals, and ripping bluesy solos. I also really love the bass guitar on this album from Danny Lilker, love the echoey sound of the drums, and that harmonized guitar part on Panic is pretty hype. On the other hand, I'm not that into the more cock-rocky tracks, especially the really cringy I'm 18. So a mix of some really great ones and some really corny tracks too, so split the difference. I'm putting this one at good. Next we have D.R.I. with the Dirty Rotten LP in 1983. This was initially an EP, but was quickly upgraded to an LP with the help from Our Radical Records. That said, it's still very short, and it's also one of two of the more hardcore punk albums on this list, but it is considered one of the first thrashcore albums, so it's worth including them here. As a fan of punk and considering crossover is one of my favorite thrash subgenres, I dig it, but all the same on this list of giants, it's not something I'm really going to readily reach for given the better options available. Definitely worth a listen at least, but going down to okay, they have better albums. We have Flotsam and Jetsam with Doomsday for the Deceiver in 1986. I actually really enjoyed their latest album and consider them to be one of the few 80s thrash and speed metal bands that are still dropping great material. Notably, it was largely written by Jason Newsted, who also provides bass and backing vocals. This was the only album he did so, though, before he joined Metallica. Fun album, but again, more in that kind of speed metal, heavy metal style that I'm not always a big fan of. I do like this better than Overkill, which we're going to talk about, but honestly, not by a whole lot, putting it at good tier. Next up is Forbidden, with Forbidden Evil in 1988. I was actually not at all familiar with this band, but there was a commenter on the Thrash band tier list that recommended a few. This one features drumming from Slayer drummer Paul Bosteph, guitarist Glenn Alveus of Testament, and Rob Flynn actually co-wrote 3 of the songs. At times it's got a bit of the same energy as Exodus and Municipal Waste in its attitude, but mixed with some very Dio-esque vocals. Through Eyes of Glass has some really great hooks, and the guitars at the end of the title track are super epic. March Into Flames really lives up to its name with some raging tremolo picking and grumbling bass lines. As Good as Dead is overflowing with solos. Really solid listen. It almost made it into fantastic, but ultimately kind of got weighed down by a few others, so I'm putting it into great tier. And there's Overkill with Feel the Fire in 1985. Another band I got a lot of comments for giving the short end of the stick during that live stream, but unfortunately, this one had a much less positive reaction than Death Angel.
It was not what I wanted!
This has more, again, of that heavy metal energy from sort of Iron Maiden, which just isn't really my thing in general. Like, I appreciate Iron Maiden, I love the classic albums, but it's just not my favorite style. So where this album ranks for you is going to be largely dependent on how you feel about that sound. Like, there's plenty objectively to appreciate here, especially in the guitar work and Ellsworth's vocal range, but it's just not my bag. Probably gonna get some hate for this, but this one's going to okay for me.
Get real.
Next up, Celtic Frost with Morbid Tales in 1984. I had a few albums I was on the fence about even including that we're going to get to, but ultimately I decided this one fits. It's another that was initially released as an EP, but soon after was upgraded to a mini LP. And another one that had a pretty significant impact on the early black metal scene, and one that Fenriz of Darkthrone brings up a lot. I've always loved that even after various style changes, this band has had a very signature guitar tone. Like, I don't even know how to describe it, but you hear it, and despite it being pretty unassuming, you can instantly recognize it, as well as its influence on Darkthrone's guitar style as well. I gotta say, is it a hot take to actually like this album more than to Megatherion? Because I do. I just think it's more focused and cohesive. The atmosphere is better. A very brisk 25-minute jam with some doomy energy as well. Putting it at great tier. I'm actually gonna put that alongside Sepultura. Then another surprise here, Morbid Saint with Spectrum of Death in 1989. Another band I was not familiar with, and given that they have very little material, I guess that's not really surprising, but that said, this is a total banger. Like I've been saying, I really like the harsh and gnarly stuff, and Pat Lynn's vocals are really doing it for me on that front. It's exactly what I'd expect the Crypt Keeper looking thing on the cover to sound like, and with the rough production and darker tone of the riffs, it makes for a really wicked listen. Every track sounds like it's clawing its way out of hell. Damien has a seriously infectious groove, and holy shit, the drumming on Crying for Death earned this a spot on Perfection. It's kind of an upset. Had no prior familiarity with this, so I'm looking forward to jamming it a whole lot more, and my understanding is they're working on new material. Alright, another sort of proto-thrash inclusion here. We have Suicidal Tendencies with Suicidal Tendencies in 1983.
Sometimes I try to do things
it just doesn't work out the way I want it to.
Another album that's largely just hardcore punk, but it has enough clout from the likes of Scott Ian repping it as a huge influence, and I decided to just keep it on. Not to mention some incorporations of metal guitar work that ultimately ended up being foundational for just the genre as a whole, especially for crossover. Being perfectly honest, I don't love this album.
Move this man!
Like, even as a fan of punk, I think a lot of these tracks kind of run together, save for a few like Possessed and Institutionalized, which is ultimately, again, just a punk track. That's probably going to be mega sacrilege to some people out there, but I'd rather be honest than correct, so just send your hate below by all means.
Let the hate flow through you.
Ultimately, I'm gonna, it's got some legacy, so I'm not gonna put it at okay, I'm gonna put it at good. I owe you a Pepsi. Speaking of Scott Ian, we have Stormtroopers of Death with Speak English or Die in 1985. Now, first of all, if there are any Zoomers in the audience, that title is clearly satire, so put away your TikTok or Twitter. Also, for anyone that watched Headbangers Ball back in the day, portions of a number of these songs were used as commercial breaks. This album happened mainly because Anthrax still had studio time left after recording Spreading the Disease, so Scott Ian and Charlie Benante got some friends together and used that time to record this. Also of note, the first blast beat is sometimes attributed to the song Milk. As for what I think, despite being almost thrown together as kind of a joke, the music is pure headbang and with a particularly sardonic sense of humor that I appreciate, especially now when we could really use it. And I also just appreciate just how damn heavy it gets. I'm calling this one great tier. Then we have Coroner with R.I.P. in 1987. Another Swiss thrash group with Tom G. Warrior even contributing lyrics to Spiral Dream. The piano intro on this one has some Twin Peaks vibes to it. Big emphasis though on technicality and speed, with a few more artsy instrumentals to break it all up. The highlight is definitely Tommy's level of precision on the guitar, especially when he delves into the neoclassical side of things. Honestly, I think his guitar speaks more in the instrumentals more than the vocals do on the entire album, and unfortunately I just don't feel like the performances, while strong, are backed up by the greatest songwriting. It's kind of like a style over substance issue, so that ultimately put this down in good tier. Next up is Sadist with Illusions in 1988. This was reissued later as Chemical Exposure in 1991 via Roadrunner, which is how it appears in Spotify, in case you get confused. Darren Travis really tearing it up with these vocals, which feel like kind of a cross between Slayer and Kreator. Steve DiGiorgio also playing bass here, as he has on seemingly every major thrash and death metal band at some point. They mix thrash elements with technical death metal, and the result is right up my alley. Lots of really wild, impressive guitar work here. There are a few blemishes with some repetitive riffs that overstay their welcome, but aside from that, this is going to fantastic for me. Then we have Heathen with Breaking the Silence, 1987. Another band I wasn't previously familiar with either, so thanks again to that audience member for turning me on to a lot of cool stuff I've overlooked, just like I try to do for you all out there. And another band with tinges of classic heavy metal in the vocals, but they keep things heavy and chuggy enough to win me over. They also go for fewer songs, but with longer runtimes, which in general I think is a bad choice in this genre, but it seems like these guys are among the short list of bands that can actually pull it off, thanks to some pretty dynamic songwriting. Death by Hanging is great, Open the Grave has some surprising twists, Breaking the Silence delivers on fantastic guitar harmonies, and Pray for Death alternatively is just a straight thrasher. This one was another one that it was on great, it kind of got bumped down, so I'm putting it really high up on good tier. Back to another big one with Destruction and Infernal Overkill in 1985. Another band still dropping some of their best stuff today, and despite being overshadowed by some of their peers, they still have their place. I'd say this album is a consistent headbanger, but relatively straightforward, somewhat to a fault. It just feels very even keel and lacking in some of the bigger peaks of my favorites on here, although I do enjoy Thrash Attack despite it being an instrumental. Some people love this album, I just like it, and another possible hot take, but I also actually think Diabolical is a superior album, which I consider to be a compliment, but I'm sure some longtime fans are not going to feel the same. Too bad, stay mad. Putting this one at great tier Hope that's good enough for you. Next up, Exodus with Bonded by Blood in 1985. Definitely a classic album, a somewhat divisive one, but among my favorites from the band overall. The opening title track is one of my favorite thrash openers of all time, which is interesting because it has such a weird chorus vocally and like how the words are delivered. Just very different, kind of an acquired taste, I would say, overall in terms of this approach. And it's the only full-length album with Paul Bailoff on vocals. Very fun album and highly influential. Maybe not the best of the best here, but still very strong. This one is going to fantastic. And we have Dark Angel with We Have Arrived in 1985. Apparently reactions to this album were pretty split when it came out, and even today I think that kind of holds true. Personally, I'm on the side of it's just okay. Like, it's a solid listen with some standout moments, but on this list it ends up sliding down the totem pole. The best elements that really stand out for me are Rob Jan's work on the bass and Jack Schwartz's drumming. So yeah, just okay. Next up, Violence with Eternal Nightmare in 1988. Now, this may actually be my favorite album cover on this list. It's eye-catching, I love the color and composition, and it perfectly suits the music. And thankfully, the musicianship is incredibly strong to back that up. The guitar hooks, bass, and crazy fast drumming are all working together so well on this album as if they're all part of a singular machine. Notably, another mention of Machine Head's Rob Flynn, too, here playing rhythm guitar. Unfortunately, I don't find Sean Killian's vocals to be on the same level here. Like, they're workable, but not great by comparison to some of the others here. I do love the implementation of the gang vocal moments though, so not quite perfection, but still going to fantastic. Might even put it a little bit higher than Megadeth. Nuclear Assault, Game Over, 1986. Another album with solid guitar work, but vocals that kind of get on my nerves. There's some really great energy in the riffs, and along with the rugged production, it does capture some of the apocalyptic franticness of the concept. But seriously, much more so than what I was just saying about Sean. I think John Connolly's voice is just straight up like nails on a chalkboard for me. Plenty of people out there enjoy this more than I do, and respect where it's due, but it's my list, so it's going to good tier. Alright, Venom, Welcome to Hell, 1981. So I was really on the fence about including this one, as it is definitely more of a, again, proto-thrash album with heavy influence on both thrash and black metal bands who would more fully represent either genre in the future. But I put the vote to the community tab, and almost 60% of you said to include them despite good arguments I saw on both sides. So consider this one like a grandparent of thrash. As for how it is, I absolutely love it. I also think it's their best album. I think it's way stronger than black metal. Grimy, grim, and combining elements of heavy metal, speed metal, and what would evolve into thrash with satanic imagery. It's like a rock and roll album for demons. It's pretty much perfection. On any other list it might hit there. I will dock it one tier for not being that thrashy though, so putting it at fantastic. And I figured if we're going to include that, we might as well also include Bathory's 1984 self-titled album. Now remember, this was before black metal was even truly a thing, and it wasn't until almost a decade later that Bathory was sort of retroactively turned into a black metal band. Within the context of the time, this is very much just another thrash metal album that happens to have particularly grim, snarly vocals. And honestly, I've been a fan of this album for a long time, and it only seems to get better with each listen. My favorite is still Bloodfire Death from this era, but goddamn, Quorthon really brought the energy and riffs, and it's no wonder that all of those edgy Norwegian kids took notice at this happening just over the border in Sweden. Total Rager, honestly, one of my favorites on here. It's going to perfection. Next up, Toxic with World Circus in 1987. Funny that I could totally see someone making this same album cover today. Some things never change, I guess. Anyways, I was blown away by Dismorta in 2022. You can see how high I ranked that on my 2022 thrash album ranking list that I did. But as someone who was new to the group, it definitely made me excited to check out their small back catalog. And I've got to say, out of all of the falsetto-slinging thrash singers, this band has consistently had some of the best. And when matched with Josh Christian's insane shredding, it makes me want to jump into a mosh pit every single time I hit play. Tracks like Heart Attack, Social Overlord, and Haunted Earth are, to me, like peak representations of all the best qualities of this style of the genre. Another one that fell just short of perfection, it's going to fantastic. Next up, Sodom with Obsessed by Cruelty in 1986. Another particularly raw and gritty album that was an inspiration to early black metal. Euronymous even named his record label after the track Death Like Silence. Similar to Sepultura in some ways, this is a very dark, cavernous sounding album with a particularly wicked aesthetic. It's messy, it's ugly, it's gnarly, so it's kind of right up my alley, isn't it? It's one of the lower fan-rated albums on Metal Storm, with the next two absolutely destroying it, but I still personally find it just so well suited to my own taste. I love me some black and thrash, and this is one of like the OGs of that style, so put it at great tier. Then there's Possessed with Seven Churches in 1985. Another band ultimately voted in, even though they also lean pretty heavily into death metal, some even calling this like the first death metal album. I also featured it on my death metal album tier lists. That said, all the musicianship is still very much steeped in thrash, and at this point, given what you've learned about my specific taste, you can probably guess what I have to say about it. I tend to like my thrash on the more extreme side, and this is about as far as you can get towards that end of the spectrum for this era. If you ask me, every single track on here is just pure destruction that makes even Slayer seem like Carly Rae Jepsen. So I'm putting this one pretty high up on perfection tier. And speaking of which, we have Slayer with Show No Mercy in 1983. My personal favorite of the big four, since I like things again on the heavier side, and I love the evil atmosphere, even if it's not quite as evil, quite as intense as Possessed, it's great here. Like, in general, this satanic vibe that really wasn't a big thing back then. Like, now it's kind of tired and overdone, but back then, it was actually prompting mail from the Parents Music Resource Center telling them to stop making albums. Like, imagine if they only knew how much more crazy metal would get from here. Like, if I had a time machine, I would love to hand Tipper Gore a copy of something like Lord Mantis' Death Mask and just record her reaction.
Oh, won't somebody please think of the children?
Anyways, really fun songs and head-bobbing energy. Another great front-to-back listen to. I'm curious to hear what people think about this in the comments, but I do wonder if people who generally dislike Tom's vocals might find this one a little bit more palatable. And I'm not sure if this is still true, but it was Metal Blade's highest-selling release. This one is also going to perfection. Whew, y'all, that was a beast, but check out this playlist for plenty more thrash metal related rankings, or this one for some death metal album rankings. And let me know again down in the comments, how would you rank these albums differently? What's your biggest disagreement? Let's have a conversation about it. It makes it more fun. But that'll do it for now. Flight of Icarus signing off. I will see you in the trenches.